Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Sonali.
The International Monetary Fund has just announced that the global fossil fuel industry receives a shocking $5.3 trillion in subsidies every year. That's equivalent to about $10 million a minute, and vastly outnumbers the amounts that governments spend on healthcare, for example. A big portion of the subsidies stem from the cleanup of pollution and climate change. Here in the U.S., another example of how the fossil fuel industry gets special treatment is unfolding in Denton, Texas, the fracking capital of the U.S. Texas Governor Greg Abbott just signed a law that forbids any municipality in the state from passing a referendum or ordinance banning gas and oil drilling operations. The law undoes the hard-fought victory by Denton residents last November to ban fracking in their city. And meanwhile, in an action reflecting popular discontent with oil giants, hundreds of protesters at the port of Seattle yesterday blocked oil workers from reaching a Shell oil rig that was on its way to resuming offshore drilling in the Arctic. The action is one of a series aimed at Shell. Bob, I wonder if the fossil fuel industry would even exist or be profitable if it weren't for the fact that it's being propped up by political elites that pour money into their coffers and just favor them with laws and permits.
Well, I guess we could talk about the insanity of Arctic drilling. We could talk about the incoherence of the economic system. But if it's okay with you, let's beat up on Texas for a little bit here.
Yes, let's.
Your story about, or your comment about Denton is very interesting. The hypocrisy of the Texas legislature and its governor is quite striking. Remember when the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency, has been trying to regulate some of these pollution and environmental questions, the state of Texas has said, don't impose your federal laws on us. We know better at the state level. When the city of Denton, a very progressive city in North Texas, decides that the Texas Railroad Commission, which despite its odd name is the regulator here, when it's not doing its job, it takes democracy seriously and passes this local ordinance. Then the state says, oh, no, not too much democracy at that level. This is purely hypocritical, as you point out, purely a defense of the fossil fuel industry. And as a Texan, I take especially take umbrage at it this morning.
And a new study has concluded that the rate of suicide among black children has significantly increased over the last several decades, during the same period when the rate among white children has dropped. The findings surprised even the researchers who examined the rarely studied age group of 5 to 11 years of age. A New York Times report on the study speculated whether anything about, quote, family support, religious faith, and other cultural factors might have changed to reflect the rise in suicide among black children. Meanwhile, in St. Louis, Missouri, an off-duty police officer who fatally shot a black teen named Von Derritt Myers Jr. last October will not face any charges. Officer Jason Flannery claims Myers shot at him with a handgun, to which he responded by firing 17 rounds. But Myers' family believes the young man never had a gun to begin with. Bob, it shocked me that the New York Times tried to blame black culture for higher suicide rates rather than, say, police violence aimed at black youth and this general culture of injustice and uncaring in our society towards black kids. What do you think?
Well, I'm not surprised by it. There's a reflexive move on white institutions, and of course the New York Times is a white institution, to look for the problem not in white supremacy, not in the pathology of white communities, which after all dominate in this culture, but instead to look to black culture as the source of the problem. This study is very interesting because suicide is the one place where the disproportionate racial impacts seem to be worse for whites than for blacks, but that seems to be changing. I think you're right. The incredible increase in attention to and the underlying consistency of things like police violence, the way in which inner city communities have been essentially ignored generation after generation, it seems to me is where we would look for the explanation for this. But that leads to other more disturbing questions about the nature of white supremacy, and the New York Times and other institutions are not quick to go there.
And finally, lawmakers in Arizona, two new reports have just emerged about the callousness of government in Arizona. Lawmakers just voted to reduce the lifetime limit of welfare recipients to the shortest in the nation, 1 year. In the short term, that means 1,600 families, including 2,700 children, will immediately lose benefits that the state administers and the federal government funds. The Republican-dominated legislature wants to divert those federal funds to Arizona's Department of Child Safety, presumably so children can be safer from abuse even if they're starving. Meanwhile, in the Maryland city of Baltimore, about the same number of households, 1,600, might be going thirsty thanks to a decision to cut off water to residents who are behind on their water bills. In a move reminiscent of what happened in Detroit, Michigan last year, Baltimore's Department of Public Works has decided to target its poor residents rather than large commercial properties that also have unpaid bills but are facing no water shutoffs. Bob, today's news just made me angrier than usual, concluding with these two stories. How do you reflect on these particular stories from Arizona and Baltimore?
Well, when I read those stories, I thought about the term that's used when there's a weather emergency, and they say non-essential personnel shouldn't come to work. And it made me think, essentially what we're doing is in this country creating a class that we could call non-essential people. Perhaps that's too cynical, but there seems to be an increasing portion of the population that the officials have simply said we no longer care about. Food and water, the things that one buys with public assistance and the availability of water are not, somehow privileges. They're rights. They're basic rights that come with being a human being. And I think what you're suggesting is this country increasingly says we do not care about those essential rights for human beings. And that's a reason to be angry from my point of view.
Bob Jensen, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back.